Anna Devane had always lived with ghosts. Some wore uniforms and medals, some hid behind diplomatic immunity, and some lurked in the shadows of shattered safe houses and burned identities. She had buried enemies, lovers, friends, and pieces of herself more times than she cared to count. But nothing in her long history of calculated risks and half-measured victories prepared her for the suffocating, carefully composed silence of this disappearance. For Port Charles, it began as an absence wrapped in an explanation that sounded perfectly reasonable on paper. A sudden reassignment. A classified operation. A message passed down official channels that Anna had been recalled for a critical covert mission, beyond contact and beyond question. Those who knew her history with the WSB accepted it with varying degrees of reluctance. It fit. It was clean. It was the kind of story that allowed people to continue their lives without looking too hard at the unease in their chest. But silence is rarely clean, and this one began to rot at the edges. The people who truly knew Anna, and the enemies who studied her patterns like scripture, sensed that something was wrong not because she was gone, but because the absences in her story were too precise. No slip-ups. No traceable travel paths. No encrypted messages that only a handful of allies could decode. Just a narrative perfectly constructed to be swallowed whole. Too perfect, for someone whose life was built on improvisation and sharp corners. Far from the harbor lights and familiar streets of Port Charles, Anna woke to darkness that smelled of metal, antiseptic, and memory. She had been restrained before. She knew the weight and give of cuffs, the burn of rope, the bite of cable ties. This was different. The room was engineered, temperature regulated, soundproofed, stripped of markers that could orient her. A constant low hum in the walls blurred her sense of time. A single overhead light that never flickered bright enough to cast true shadows. She tested everything in the first few hours, restraints, angles, screws, the rhythm of the hum, cataloging data with the ruthless discipline of an operative who refused to be reduced to prey. The first assault was not physical. It came in the form of images and sounds, projected on the far wall like fragments of a nightmare she had never consented to revisit. Surveillance footage of missions long buried. Grainy photos of fallen agents whose deaths had marked her file in red. Audio distortions of her own voice as a younger woman, pledging loyalty, confessing regrets, betraying men who deserved it and men who did not. The past was turned into a blade aimed squarely at her sense of self. Whoever had taken her did not want ransom, negotiation, or leverage in the usual sense. They wanted to unmake Anna Devane. Whispers about her fate began to seep through Port Charles once the official story stopped matching the emotional truth. Valentine watched, at first, in silence, measuring the inconsistencies that others dismissed as bureaucracy. Robert considered backchannels and found doors that had always been cracked open to him now sealed shut without explanation. Jason, ever the man of action, felt the uncomfortable recognition of a familiar pattern. When people with power want someone gone, they do not shout it from the rooftops. They create a story that tells everyone to stop asking questions. Laura, who had seen governments and institutions weaponize lies more subtly than any cartel, realized that the WSB's explanation for Anna's absence was polished, efficient, and wrong. This was not a call to duty. This was a cover. Back in captivity, the second phase began. The recordings changed. The images sharpened. The shadows coalesced into something far more targeted. In a moment of carefully timed torment, she heard laughter that sliced through the room like a scalpel. Not through a speaker. Not as a memory. Too tangible. Too familiar. There were few sounds in the world that could freeze her blood. This one had haunted years of her life. Faison. The name wrapped itself around her ribs like ice. His voice, or the flawless imitation of it, poured into the room, taunting, reminiscing, twisting their shared history into something obscene. Grainy footage showed his face, alive, smirking, leaning over her hospital bedside from lifetimes ago, morphing seamlessly into sharper, impossibly recent angles. Data logs flashed dates that made no sense, suggesting operations undertaken long after his supposed death. She had witnessed him die. She had felt, with a rare and brutal clarity, the closure that came from knowing that particular monster could no longer stalk her or the people she loved. Now, that certainty slid out from under her with quiet cruelty. Her captors did not chain her to a wall, they chained her to doubt. What made the torture insidious was not just the possibility of Faison's survival, but the calculated ambiguity. Every fragment of proof could be real. Every frame could be fabricated. Technology had evolved beyond simple forged passports and voice changers. Deep simulations, reconstructed biometric data, synthetic speech, these were no longer theoretical tools. Whoever orchestrated this understood that for a woman like Anna, certainty was armor. Strip that away, and she was left wrestling shadows. Yet even as her pulse spiked and her hands clenched, her training threaded through the fear. If this was Faison resurrected, he would not hide behind curated illusions. He had always craved performance, spectacle, chaos painted in broad strokes. What she was experiencing now was different, methodical, surgical, almost reverent. If this was someone using his image, then they were not simply trying to hurt her, they were trying to rewrite the narrative of her entire life. As days, or what felt like days, unfolded, a pattern emerged in her torment. Every projection centered on one question: who made Anna Devane the woman she is, and who had the right to break her? Files appeared on the walls, listing missions gone wrong, compromised identities, innocent casualties caught in the crossfire of intelligence wars. Her choices. Her failures. Her victories reframed as atrocities. Hands she could not see adjusted the variables in her environment. altering the timing of sound, the frequency of light, the content of the illusions, gauging her reactions with clinical precision. She began to suspect she was not just a prisoner, but a subject in an experiment designed to map the fault lines in her psyche. An old enemy would have taken pleasure in simple pain. This captor wanted something more intellectual, more perverse. They wanted to prove that heroes could be dismantled with their own histories. In Port Charles, the storm gathered on parallel fronts. Valentine unearthed encrypted fragments suggesting that Anna's so-called reassignment orders had been inserted retroactively. Robert heard the same anonymized denial from every official contact, as if they had been coached to recite a script. Jason tracked a series of financial transfers through shell corporations and found them intersecting with forgotten WSB black budget projects, some signed off under names that no longer existed in any public record. Laura pushed her political capital to the edge, asking questions that made people nervous. Each clue pointed away from a sanctioned mission and toward a deliberate removal, orchestrated by someone with access to old files, deep pockets, and an intimate understanding of Anna's enemies. The specter of Faison resurfaced in their conversations, whispered like a curse they were afraid to summon. Had he survived? Had one of his fanatics preserved his work? Or was someone exploiting his legacy for their own design, knowing just how effectively his name could destabilize Anna's world? Inside the cell, the turning point came not with a scream, but with refusal. As the projections replayed one carefully chosen operation from her past, one in which a young informant died because Anna had prioritized the greater mission, the voice that claimed to be Faison tried to needle her guilt into submission, insisting that every life lost had been meaningless, that her moral compass was nothing more than a self-aggrandizing myth. Anna listened. She saw the blood again. She felt the old ache. And then, quietly, she said nothing. She breathed. She remembered the faces of those she had saved, the regimes she had helped topple, the families that never knew how close they had come to annihilation. Her choices were not spotless, but they had never been casual. The people behind the wall wanted her to break under the weight of false equivalence. Instead, she made a decision. If they wanted to study her mind, they would have to contend with all of it, not just the fractures they kept replaying. They wanted her fear. She gave them defiance. That defiance shifted the game. The environment adjusted again, this time with more urgency, more volatility, as if someone behind the glass was frustrated that their variables were no longer yielding the desired outcome. The Faison voice grew harsher, less controlled. A door she had never seen opened for the briefest moment, long enough for her to catch a silhouette on the other side, standing with calculated stillness, not the feral energy of the man she once knew, but the chilling patience of someone who believed they were entitled to reshape an icon. Not Faison. Someone else. Someone who had studied him. Someone who had likely studied her. Someone who had waited a very long time to lay claim to both legacies. By the time Valentine, Robert, Laura, and Jason each followed their respective trails to the same conclusion, that Anna had been taken by a mind hiding beneath layers of institutional corruption and technological illusion, the danger had outgrown the question of whether one dead monster still lived. The real threat lay in the revelation that Port Charles, the WSB, and their shared histories had become a laboratory for a new generation of manipulators who did not care about flags or causes, only control. Anna's abduction was not an isolated act of revenge, it was a prototype. If they could fracture someone like her, they could fracture anyone. And that realization was exactly what turned a missing person mystery into a catalyst for something much larger and far more explosive. As the walls of Anna's prison narrowed around her, she understood that no one was coming to save the woman she used to be. They would have to find, and she would have to become, someone sharper, more dangerous, stripped of illusions yet anchored in something stronger than fear. Outside, the threads converged, forged orders exposed, secret donors unmasked. A network of scientists and ex-operatives revealed to be collaborating on psychological warfare built on stolen WSB archives. The face behind Anna's kidnapping would soon be forced into the light, not a ghost from the past, but a living architect of chaos who believed legends like Anna and Faison were pieces to be rearranged. And when that reveal came, it would not just reignite one old feud, it would detonate across every fragile alliance in Port Charles, dragging mobsters, lawmakers, doctors, and spies into the same battlefield. General Hospital was on the verge of a new war, one in which memory, identity, and loyalty could be weaponized as easily as a gun. Anna's suffering was the opening move, not the endgame. Whether the specter of Faison proved real, reconstructed, or merely borrowed, the damage of invoking his name had already done its work. The question was no longer only who had taken Anna, but who would stand with her once the door finally opened, and whether the woman who walked out would be the same one they thought they knew, or the first soldier forged in a darker, more terrifying conflict that was only just beginning.